On October the 5th, 1986, Eugene Hasenfuss, a US pilot, was captured by troops of the leftist Sandinista regime in Nicaragua, a Central American country, after the plane where he was flying was shot down. When questioned by those Sandinistas, Mr. Hasenfuss confessed that he was shipping military supplies into Nicaragua to be used by the right-wing Contras who were fighting against the socialist government of President Daniel Ortega. The Contras had been created and funded by the United States. Most dramatically, he claimed that the US Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA, was running the operation. And this made the Iran-Contra scandal break and cause a temporary drop in the popularity of US President Ronald Reagan. So at issue was the fact that the United States was buying or was selling arms to Iran, which was fighting a stalemated war with no clear winner against its western neighbor Iraq, while Iran actually officially was under an arms embargo. They hoped thereby to secure the release of several US hostages and to fund the Contras in Nicaragua. Under the Boland Agreement, further funding of the Contras by the US government had been prohibited by the US Congress, which at the time had a Democratic majority in the House of Representatives, but a slight Republican majority in the Senate. The scandal began as an operation to free the 7 American hostages being held in Lebanon by a group of Iranian ties connected to the Army of the Guardians of the Islamic Revolution. It was planned that Israel would ship weapons to Iran, curious given the fact that Iran was ruled, as it still is ruled, by basically fundamentalist Muslims, and that various prominent Iranians like former President Rafsanjani have made notably anti-Israel statements, although this was back then over 2 decades in the future. And then the United States would resupply Israel and receive the Israeli payment. Large modifications to the plan were devised by Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North of the National Security Council in late 1985, in which a portion of the proceeds from the weapon sales was diverted to fund anti-Sandinista and anti-communist rebels, or Contras, in Nicaragua. While President Reagan was a supporter of the Contra cause, the evidence is disputed as to whether he authorized the diversion of the money raised by the Iranian arms sales to the Contras. Handwritten notes that then Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger took in December 1985 indicate that Reagan knew of potential hostage transfers with Iran, as well as of the sale of Hawk and TOW missiles to moderate elements within that country. The investigation was impeded when large volumes of documents relating to the scandal were destroyed or withheld from investigators by Reagan administration officials. In March 1987, President Reagan returned to the airwaves in a nationally televised address, taking full responsibility for any actions that he was unaware of, and admitting that what began as a strategic opening to Iran deteriorated in its implementation into trading arms for hostages. 11 convictions resulted, some of which were vacated on appeal. The rest of those indicted or convicted were all pardoned in the final days of the presidency of George Bush, who had been vice president at the time of the affair. He had claimed to have been out of the loop, that is, not to have had access to the most confidential information during the Iran-Contra scandal, but this was disputed by various political opponents of former President Bush. Anyway, the Tower Commission, headed by former U.S. Senator John Tower, who incidentally was a Republican, criticized President Reagan for having delegated too much authority and for not having kept a sufficient control over his subordinates. According to the late American historian Henry Steele Commager in his Pocket History of the United States, President Reagan could have been deeply involved in activities that might have resulted or could have resulted in his impeachment, but both he himself distanced himself from any hardcore evidence, and of course his assistants, faithful assistants, did the same as well. However, whether President Reagan was consciously involved in such activities is still disputed. Anyway, the Tower Commission's report was published in February 1987 after 80 witnesses had been interviewed, including Reagan, and even two of the arms trade middlemen, Mr. Manucher Ghorbanifar and Mr. Adnan Khashoggi. The 200-page report criticized the actions of Oliver North, John Poindexter, Caspar Weinberger, and others. It did claim that President Reagan did not know how widespread the program was, especially the diversion of funds to the Contras. However, it was very critical of his detached style of leadership. A major result of the Tower Commission was the consensus that President Reagan should have listened to his national security advisor more, thereby placing more power in the hands of that chair. Anyway, Reagan suffered a temporary decline in his popularity, but by 1988 he had become about as popular as he had been before the scandal broke, and in January 1989, the month when he retired as president, he recorded a 64% approval rating, which was the highest ever recorded for a departing president at that time. Indeed, historian Henry Steele Commager said in his Pocket History of the United States that Reagan was almost the only U.S. president, maybe he was referring to those whose popularity had been regularly monitored by opinion polls, to have left office about as popular as he had been while entering it. And as we know, Vice President Bush, whatever his role might have been in the scandal, was able to fairly easily defeat his Democratic challenger, Governor Michael Dukakis of Massachusetts, in the November 1988 U.S. presidential election. Internationally, however, the damage was more severe. According to Magnus Ranstorp, U.S. willingness to engage in concessions with Iran and the Hezbollah not only signaled to its adversaries that hostage-taking was an extremely useful instrument in extracting political and financial concessions from the West, but also undermined any credibility of U.S. criticism of other states' deviation from the principles of no negotiation and no concession to terrorists and their demands. Oliver North, indicted on 16 counts, was found guilty by a jury of 3 felony counts. The convictions were vacated on appeal on the grounds that North's Fifth Amendment rights may have been violated by the indirect use of his testimony to Congress, which had been given under a grant of immunity. In 1990, Poindexter was convicted on several felony counts of conspiracy, lying to Congress, obstruction of justice, and altering and destroying documents pertinent to the investigation. The Office of Independent Counsel Walsh investigation produced 4 interim reports to Congress. Its final report was published as the final report of the Independent Counsel for Iran-Contra matters. Mr. Walsh's records are available at the U.S. National Archives.